Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News. Major updates today on the negative end for Red Bull. The massive crash for Sergio Perez at Monaco will cost Red Bull a lot of money to replace that car, to such an extent that sources are confirming if there's any more damage from now to the end of the season to their cars, they will suffer in terms of upgrades, not being able to bring packages they are planning for the latter half of the season. This opens the door even more to the major Ferrari and McLaren fight back and the title challenge that we may be witnessing. Very much into your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Plenty of drama in the driver market today as always, with rumours still emerging as to what the future of Esteban Ocon will be after the crash with his teammate Gasly back in Monaco. Seems like there may have been friction. I mean, obviously there's friction, it's a French team behind the scenes now for some time, but the rumour is if they're going to get rid of Ocon, if they're going to bench him effectively, which is apparently on the cards, who are they going to get instead? Could it be Jack Doohan, who is the junior Formula 2 driver basically for the team, or could it be the WEC driver Mick Schumacher? That's been, a rumour around it that potentially they could put Mick Schumacher back in the car. I think that'd be very exciting to many of us, wanting to see how he would get on somewhere other than Haas. Sergio Perez, though, by the way, despite the crash in Monaco we're going to get into, still seems to be absolutely the front runner for the Red Bull seats. Sergio Rodriguez even today says, Mexican flag, Austrian flag, tick. So he's basically saying they've re-signed him. So I don't know when this might be confirmed. There's been rumours from multiple sources. ESPN, of course, are saying that they understand that this is basically close to a done deal. Autosport have said that it's pretty certain that Perez will get the contract extension. Somewhat surprising, certainly after the last two rounds. But there are more factors maybe in play for Red Bull. We've got to understand that Perez, I think, drives probably 65-70% of their merchandise sales, which is kind of remarkable when you think that Max Verstappen is his teammate, the reigning world champion, with a massive fan base, of course, in the Netherlands. But Mexico and even South America generally, many times bigger population than the Netherlands. And, they cash in big time from Perez. So if there's no clear upgrade on track, maybe, from a business POV, it makes sense to keep Perez. I'm just not so convinced, right? I feel like signing Carlos Sainz would make a lot of sense, because you feel like if you get Sainz on the team for next season, you're almost guaranteeing the constructors in some way, whereas with Perez, or at least you're giving yourself a better chance, because right now the constructors isn't even guaranteed this year, let alone next year, based on the standings, and Perez is now 5th in the championship, which I didn't expect after the way this season began. Red Bull have, of course, told Sergio, look, focus up here a little bit, mate, especially because they cannot afford any more damage to their cars. Yes, the Perez thing wasn't his fault as far as I'm concerned. He had the racing line. Look, should he maybe have left more room for Magnussen? Maybe, but let's be honest, Magnussen, the space there was closing. He did not have anywhere near enough of his car alongside Perez's to justify being in that position as far as I'm concerned. So they both go out of the race. Hülkenberg gets taken out as well. Not good for Haas, and obviously not good for Perez either. His car was completely totaled. We'll get into it in a second, but any more pennies of damage are seriously going to affect Red Bull. This is like the overall update here. So Sainz wants a 2-year deal somewhere. Mercedes will only give him a 1-year deal because they want to ensure that they can put Antonelli in the car. Maybe it'll be next year. They might say, look, Sainz, we'll give you a year and then we're going to put somebody else in, and maybe we'll keep you if you're better than Russell, but if you're not, you're probably going to go. Williams and Audi would give him a 2-year deal. Maybe Audi even a 3-year or a 2+1 or something like that. So, it's a very important decision here for Sainz to be made. The Mercedes offer being kind of rescinded or, not being what he would like, that is what it is. The fact that the Red Bull offer is not going to be there for Sainz, I think, is a bit of a blow, really. Especially given the state of Formula 1 at the moment, you'd have thought, especially on the Red Bull side. Also, rumours emerging that the Alpine-Ocon friction was in place before the crash, which is probably expected and understandable, but there were rumours as well that Ocon was in contact with Haas. So maybe Alpine have seen that and thought, you know what, on your bike, mate, we're just going to get rid of you now. It would be a very Alpine way to operate. I don't think it was that long ago when Mattia Binotto was actually linked to Alpine about a potential return as a team principal. Now we're hearing about Aston Martin talking to Mattia Binotto. Now, I don't expect if he was to go to Aston, he would join as the team principal. I just don't think that's Binotto's best place. We saw it at Ferrari, it wasn't really working. As a technical engineering minds, I think he's a very talented man. So I don't think Aston would fall into chaos if they were to sign Binotto in the same way that it's clearly, wasn't working at Ferrari compared to Fred Vasseur. But it's interesting to hear that Binotto could be back on the grid sooner rather than later. Speaking of Ferrari, they have upgrades on the way. Silverstone time is when they seem to be targeting the upgrades that will attempt to bring them closer to Red Bull, if not above Red Bull, in overall qualifying pace. Because quali pace, surprisingly this year for Ferrari, has been their weakness. It's been their absolute best thing for the last couple of years. That's why Charles Leclerc has scored so many pole positions, and until a couple of days ago, the last 12 of those were not converted into victories, with, of course, Max Verstappen taking basically all of those. But, Charles Leclerc finally got one on the board in Monaco, which was great to witness. It nearly didn't happen though because of an engine problem that happened after FP3. Now there's been some discussion as to whether this was actually a big deal or not, whether that engine is usable again. I think Formula Uno have said that it really was no big deal, but they had some sort of anomalous signal from the oil temperature sensor in the car and it weren't looking good. So they decided, all right, we're not going to let this Monaco curse occur again, and we are going to get this power unit out of Charles' car and we are going to put the one that worked in Miami in, because it's not a power sensitive circuit here in Monaco. You can turn down the engine, it's not going to matter. You're going to be able to win the Grand Prix, which is of course eventually what happened. But it was on the touch and go, right? You know what I mean? Like, it was scary. If Ferrari hadn't noticed this problem with the oil temperature sensor, then they might not have made the change. Who knows what would have happened? Again, sources are saying that actually the engine's fine. It was just an anomaly, but still, imagine if his engine blew up. And that would have just been so sad to see again for another time in Monaco. By the way, they are expecting by Barcelona, so a couple of races' time, to find out the full potential and understand all the elements of the SF24. Then their upgrade at Silverstone is going to bring qualifying efficiency to the car. But even with big upgrades on the way for Ferrari, they're not far off Max Verstappen. Yes, he had the DNF in Australia, but think back to 2022. He DNF'd in Bahrain, he DNF'd in Australia that year as well, and he was still 34 points ahead of Leclerc in the championship after 8 races. Now, in those 8 races, Baku and Spain had happened, and for Leclerc fans out there, I don't really want to have to relive those again. But nonetheless, 34 points was the gap in 2022. This year it's 31 points. And of course, at the time, 8 races into 22, it was quite clear what direction the momentum was taking. This year, it's arguably the other way. Now, there is a good argument to say that this is, in terms of tracks, one of the hardest runs that you're going to see in the entire season for Red Bull. Based on the limitations, clearly, of their car, Singapore's probably not going to be great again either, unless they can bring major upgrades. But even Red Bull are saying that this weakness they have inherent over the bumps and curbs, that is maybe a necessary sacrifice in order to have the best overall concept for this generation of cars. There is that argument to be made that if you want to make the mechanical platform the best it can be, you're going to have compromise, and the compromise is seen at these type of tracks. Maybe it wasn't seen last year so much because the field was less competitive to Red Bull than it is this year, but all of a sudden Ferrari have made massive gains, McLaren have made massive gains, and they get exposed to Red Bull on these type of weekends. But all of these tracks, Imola to some extent, but certainly Monaco, certainly Miami, and Canada should be the same, should be problematic for the Red Bull in some way. So maybe this is the worst run they're going to have all season. I certainly expect Max Verstappen to be back on the podium, back on the top step of the podium very soon indeed, if not next weekend in Canada. But they are vulnerable. The pressure is most certainly on. Even Sainz says Verstappen's error in qualifying shows that Red Bull are feeling the pressure. Even Fred Vasseur said that Verstappen made more errors in Imola than he did over the entirety of last season, which, whether you want to say whether that's fair analysis or not, nonetheless, it shows that Ferrari feel like they're putting the pressure on Max, and if Max doesn't have it easy cruising at the front, he is going to make errors. Everyone is prone to them, and especially when the pressure is on. I wouldn't say the pressure is building, but Red Bull have to be, they have to realise, and Max has to realise, this championship is far from over if the current trajectory we have seen over the last few rounds continues. Now, still over the last few rounds, Max has still been level on points with Leclerc and Norris pretty much, so it's not like he's falling behind in terms of his championship lead, but it is diminishing with respect to the amount of points scored over the entirety of the season. Carlos Sainz still says, look, on normal tracks, let's say when we go to Spain, that's what I'm interested to see. How far ahead are they going to be in Spain? I think they're probably going to be ahead. Are they going to be miles ahead in Barcelona? Is it going to be a competitive race? That does very much so remain to be seen, but there's only 24 points in the Constructors' Championship right now, and other teams are bringing upgrades. Toto says the same thing. Look, more conventional tracks, we still believe Red Bull are good. It's not a crisis at Red Bull. It's difficult to say where the teams are going to be in the longer term. And even Christian Horner comes out and kind of defends his team and says, look, it's not as if we've got a bad car all of a sudden. Canada, Spain, Austria, Silverstone coming up. Let's see how we are after that. It's a marathon, not a sprint. The track has been resurfaced. Let's see what that does to the balance of the car. This is another point as well, right? Because the bumps Red Bull seem to struggle with, and Canada is a pretty bumpy track. But if it's been resurfaced, that may no longer be the case, or it might be worse. Who knows? So we shall see when we get to the circuit Gilles Villeneuve exactly what happens there. Mercedes, they're bringing upgrades too. Their new front wing, actually, that Russell ran, that the team has said, yeah, that was better than the one that Hamilton had on, is kind of similar to last year's W14 spec, actually. They've kind of abandoned that whole tricky front wing element idea they came up with at the start of the season, but Mercedes are bringing upgrades like every single round. I mean, look, they can afford it under the cost cap, and we'll get into that in a second on the Red Bull side, but basically every single race, they're going to have new parts. Like, they are trying at Mercedes to bring the challenge. It's going to be tough. They were 3-ish tenths off pole in Monaco, which isn't bad for them over the last few years, to be fair. Maybe that type of circuit masked the weakness of these type of cars, this era of Mercedes, especially this Mercedes, when high-speed corners are not necessarily its friend in terms of rear stability, and that is certainly a strength of the McLaren right now. And Piastri actually said after the race, it's not just that we fought for victory here in Monaco, we fought for victory everywhere over the last few rounds. One, of course, in Miami, second place in Imola, could have won it potentially in the hands of Lando Norris, and then Piastri on the podium very comfortably indeed here in Monaco. So Piastri says, look, it's not just like last year where the McLaren at the end of the season was good, very good, but it was really only good at high-speed circuits with very high-speed corners, where the Red Bull was also really strong. This year, it can be good everywhere, it seems, and that's why Piastri is confident enough to say we can definitely be in the fight for the win every single weekend. And is this the year that Piastri gets his first victory? It wouldn't be out of the realms of possibility. Hamilton, of course, racked up his 54th fastest lap this past weekend, and that actually breaks another record for the most fastest laps held by a driver for a single team, breaking Michael Schumacher's record of 53. Max Verstappen is there in third for Red Bull, but what does this mean for Red Bull? These last few rounds of racing have not just been bad for points scored, but have been bad for the amount of damage caused. It's a common discussion with drivers that may, I wouldn't say pay drivers precisely, but let's call them pay drivers. Drivers that aren't the best, they crash sometimes, they cause damage, but look, they bring in the sponsorship revenue. And that's great, and that kind of equation actually works out in favour of the teams. Certainly pre-cost cap. But in the cost cap, it's a bit of a different story. The teams will allocate some amount of money for crash damages. But the problem is, you don't really know how much crash damage you're going to have. And anything that you spend on repairing cars, which is under the cost cap, it takes away from what else you might spend on catering or something else if you're Red Bull Racing GmbH or whatever they're technically called. So the Red Bull apparently suffered $2 to $3 million in crash damage. That's what Helmut Marko said. And actually Horner said the same thing. Or maybe it was just Horner that said this, but whatever. The damage is 2 or 3 million. I think Helmut Marko might have said it was 2.5 plus. So even if they're exaggerating, let's say it's 1.52 million. That's a lot of money to repair that car. And Horner says, look, that's a big handicap for us with the budget cap. So you always got to wonder, okay, how much impact is this really going to have? The team might say one thing, but have they actually budgeted for this amount of damage? Who knows? But actually today, sources are telling Giuliano De Cesso at Formula Uno that if there's any additional damage, like effectively this crash for Checo here in Monaco, not his fault, but this crash, and okay, you say it's not his fault. If you're battling with Magnussen, you're asking for trouble, and you shouldn't be down there with Magnussen. So, in some level, it's his fault, because when you're near Magnussen, things can go wrong this season, as we've said a few times, and maybe don't qualify P18 would be one of the answers. But it's possible the amount of damage they've incurred there is effectively the entire limit that they had for the entire season in terms of damage allocation. If they have any more damage costs, so if they crash again with any car, even a front wing might cost you, 250 grand to replace or whatever it is. So apparently they've reached their limit in terms of what they can actually afford. And we talk about this with Williams and other teams, that they can't really afford to bring upgrades if they keep crashing all the time and if they keep breaking the cars. They may be forced to postpone or even abandon their late season upgrades. Often we see upgrades in like Austin, stuff like that. We get the Silverstone ones, and then towards the end of the season, Austin, round about there, August time, September time, we'll see some upgrades before the end of the season. They have been planned for Red Bull. Of course, every team has their development packages. They might not be fully sure what they're planning to do yet, but they have a timeline for when they're going to try and bring upgrades to the car. Apparently, though, Red Bull may be cooked. Like, they may run out of money, effectively, and not be able to actually manufacture those parts of the car. They may need to postpone them or even just get rid of them entirely. if they can't afford to do so, which is potentially a pretty big deal, right? Because let's say we have a competitive championship, Red Bull and Verstappen are still leading going into like Austin, but on that weekend, Red Bull don't have enough money left in the cap, so they can't bring any upgrades, whereas Ferrari, Mercedes, McLaren, they bring a few new parts, and maybe that's enough for, Verstappen to start getting second or start getting third, or struggling more to put it on pole than he did right at the start of the season, right? So I think very fascinating to see how this goes from now to the end of the year, because the lead that Verstappen has is, not as sizable as it was last year. Last year, this time into the season, Verstappen was at 195, Perez at 126, then it was Alonso, Hamilton. This year, of course, very different story when the Mercedes are further down 7th and 8th here, and it's the McLarens and the Ferraris that are in the mix, of course. But Verstappen has fewer points than last season, quite considerably so. Leclerc has more. Perez is down in 5th behind Sainz, of course, which is maybe quite telling for Sainz's ambitions as to try and get that seat, especially when, let's be honest, Sainz missed a race back in Jeddah when Ollie Behrman took his place. And just a couple of final things to close out with I thought were pretty interesting. So F1 24 is coming out soon. I don't think it's going to be very good, I'm not going to lie, based on what I've seen, but, maybe time will tell. They've released the driver ratings for this, and I always find these kind of fascinating because I don't really know who cooks these up or where, what they're smoking, to be fair. But here we go anyway. So Verstappen's number one, obviously, fair enough. Like, best driver in the field, performing at an incredible level. Then it's kind of interesting because we have Sainz, Leclerc, Norris, and Hamilton all on 89. Which is, maybe you can justify it in certain ways. They look at experience and pace and these other factors in terms of, where they should lie. But Alonso is like second on 92. Like, they're saying that Alonso is considerably better than Sainz, Leclerc, Norris, and Hamilton, which just isn't the case, really. So, anyway, those are your top 6 in various orders. Then you got Perez here, which is just like, Perez gets gassed so hard at these every year, I'm not going to lie. He's up there at an 87 with Russell, then Albon, Piastri, Tsunoda still down there at an 81, Sargent's on a 70, which is pretty rough, I'm not going to lie. Everyone else on 80 and above. The fact that Sargent has 70 and Zhou has 80 is pretty damning, even Stroll has 80 as well. So I don't really know who's cooked these up, but whatever, thought they were kind of interesting. But very much intrigued to your thoughts on all this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.